2, 1.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council for Monday, December 15th. My name is William Lutz, President of Council. It's my honor to lead us in the invocation tonight. Pledge of Allegiance, please stand. Heavenly Father, this time of year we give thanks and we are grateful. We are grateful for the community we live in. We're grateful for the men and women who every day selflessly serve to make this community a wonderful place to live for all of our residents, a beautiful place to visit for all of our visitors, and a great place to work. Lord, at this time, give our happy hearts, our grateful hearts, a sense to defeat the division that's all around us, Lord, because you know division has never solved a problem. Division has never fed a hungry mouth. Division has never created a good career and a good job for a family in need. So, Lord, help us fight division each and every day, and let us be grateful for this community we live in. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Terwilliger.
Here.
Mr. Sievert.
Present.
Mr. Twist.
Here.
Mrs. Snee. Here. Mr. Rozelle.
Here.
Mr. Swayzer.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Present.
Mr. Whidden.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Move to excuse Mr. Phillips. Second.
It has been moved to excuse Mr. Phillips by Mr. Schwayzer. Welcome back. And seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert.
Yes. Move his card, Mr. Sievert. I'm trying to get her grandpa. Card picking there.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee. Yes. Mr. Rozelle.
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read a summary of the minutes in the November 1st, 2021 meeting of Troy City Council?
Minutes of Council, November 1, 2021. Committee reports. Community and Economic Development Committee recommended legislation be prepared to provide for legislative action for the Sheridan annexation. Committee recommends legislation be prepared accepting recommendation of the Planning Commission to approve the final revised record plan for Troy Christian Schools Performing Arts Center plan development. Law and Ordinance Committee recommended legislation be prepared to align the 6 wards based on the census. Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing appropriation of several parcels of property. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing grant applications to MVRPC for paving programs on North Elm and on East Main Street. Committee also recommended legislation be prepared authorizing increase in the authorization for water meter supply for 2021. Resolution number R44, 2021, adjusting fees related to various services, second reading and adopted. Resolution number R45, 2021, Employee Council for Collective Bargaining, second reading and adopted. Resolution number R46, 2021, Agreement with Public Defender for 2022, first reading and adopted. Resolution R47, 2021, Establishing Services for Proposed Annexation. The Sheridan annexation was given first reading and was adopted. Resolution number R48, 2021, Establishing Buffer Requirements for Proposed Sheridan Annexation, first reading and adopted. Resolution R49, 2021, Consenting to the Annexation of the Sheraton property, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R50, 2021, Increasing Authorization for Water Meters, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R51, 2021, Authorizing submittal of grant application for North Elm Street paving program, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R5221, authorizing application to MVRPC for East Main Street resurfacing project, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 054, 2021, repealing ordinance sections to realign the wards, was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 055, 2021, accepting revised final record plan Troy Christian Schools Plan Development was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 056, 2021, final acceptance of an annexation was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 057, 2021, filing petition for appropriation of real property, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 058, 2021, filing petition of appropriation of real property was given first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 059, 2021, petition for appropriation of certain real property was given first reading and postponed indefinitely. Ordinance number 060, 2021, appropriation of certain real property, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 061, also a petition for appropriation of certain real property, first reading and adopted. Following various comments, council adjourned at 7:56 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. How's council wishes to dispose of the minutes?
Move to accept. Second.
We move to approve the minutes by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Siebert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We have 7 reports this evening. We'll begin with the first 4 reports from the Community and Economic Development Committee, and Mrs. Snee.
Thank you, Mr. President. This committee met on November 8th to discuss a proposed draft ordinance to establish a vacant property registration program for commercial and industrial buildings. Committee members Twist and Snee indicated that they did not find that a vacant property registration is warranted at this time. Committee member Rozell commented that he could see further review of such a program, but not as a reaction to the recent demolition application presented to the Planning Commission. The committee does not recommend legislation. At the direction of the committee, staff will research and analyze whether there is a vacant building issue and will provide a report outlining any alternative programs for review and discussion in early 2022. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Are there any comments or questions on the report? Mrs. Snee, please continue.
Thank you. This committee met on November 8th to discuss if a moratorium should be established on new demolition applications in the Historic Preservation Overlay District. This moratorium would allow for a review and recommendation of staff regarding consideration of any amendments to the city's ordinances regarding such demolition applications. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to establish a 180-day moratorium on the issuance of new certificates of appropriateness to allow for the demolition or removal of a historic or contributing building, structure, or architectural feature within the City of Troy Historic Preservation Overlay District boundaries, with the exception of the demolition of a building or structure based on a finding by the Miami County building official or the fire chief of the City of Troy, Ohio, that requires the immediate demolition due to an imminent safety concern. The committee further supports emergency legislation so that the moratorium commences without delay. We do note that moratoriums may be shortened or lengthened if warranted. And this is also respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Mrs. Snee, please continue.
This committee met on November 8th to discuss if a moratorium on new surface parking lot construction should be established for the downtown area. There is a series of studies that have been done regarding parking and parking lots in the Historic Preservation Overlay District, and time will be needed for the committee and council to adequately review those studies and determine if any further action is warranted. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to establish a 90-day moratorium on the construction of new surface parking lots in the Historic Preservation Overlay District, where such parking lot would be considered the principal use on that property and not accessory to a different principal use. The committee further supports emergency legislation so that the moratorium commences without delay. We do note that moratoriums may be shortened or lengthened if warranted. Respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Mrs. Snee, please go ahead.
And finally, this committee met November 8th to consider the petition filed for the annexation from Concord Township of 2.0 acres located at Washington Road, known as the Camp-Farelli annexation. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to provide for the 3 legislative items required by state law related to the Camp-Farelli annexation of 2.0 acres from Concord Township. To meet the timeline of the state law for an expedited annexation, the committee supports emergency legislation. Respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Snee. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Personnel Committee and Mr. Twist.
Thank you, Mr. President. This committee met on November 8th regarding the hourly wage for various seasonal and part-time positions. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to be effective January 1, 2022, to amend the hourly rate paid to seasonal and part-time positions, including interns and swimming pool manager, that will reflect the impact of the January 1st, 2022 adjustment in the Ohio minimum wage rate. And that is respectfully submitted by Todd Sievert, Jeffrey Whitten, and myself, William Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Twist. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to the Safety and Health Committee and Mr. Terwilliger.
Thank you, Mr. President. This committee met November 8th to discuss the 2022 funding of the Miami County Health District. Troy's funding is based on the millage equivalents that will be paid by the other political subdivisions in the county for public health services. Troy's payment is funded from the general fund. The 2022 funding would be $365,873.84, a decrease of approximately 4.5% from the 2021 funding. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to approve the 2022 funding for the Miami County Health District for public health services for Troy citizens in the amount of $365,873.84. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Schilling, and myself as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Terwilliger. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll go on to the last report tonight, and standing in for Mr. Phillips is Mr. Schilling with the Streets and Sidewalks Committee.
Thank you. The committee members, Snee and Schilling, met on November 8th, 2021 to consider recommending that the city bid for the West Main Street Utility Duct Bank Improvements Project. This project is required ahead of the West Main Street Corridor Improvements Project so that the overhead communication and fiber optics utility companies are relocated underground. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the West Main Street Utility Duct Bank Improvements at a total cost not to exceed $700,000. This is respectfully submitted by myself, Mrs. Snee, and Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Are there any comments or questions on this report? Seeing none, we'll move on to citizen comments on items on the agenda. We have 5 resolutions and 3 ordinances on our agenda this evening. If you wish to speak on those topics, you're invited to come to the lectern. I'll give your name and address, and you have 2 minutes to address council. And Mr. Kerber will be our timekeeper.
All right. I promise I won't take too long, Mr. Kerber.
Okay. Let's give Mr. Kerber just a second.
All right.
Get the clock ready. All right, it's ready. Mr. Barrier, you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Council President. My name is Bradley Barringer. I live at 105 Crestwood Drive, and I want to speak tonight on 063-2021, 180-day moratorium on any certificates of appropriateness and demolition permits in the historic downtown overlay district. When I was at the committee meeting last week, I posed the question, would this moratorium apply to the Oddfellows building? I got a bit of a non-answer from Mr. Titterington, and I appealed to the council when they're considering this legislation tonight that if it does not include that building, it should. Because that's the building, let's face it, that brought us to this point. And I think we can all agree on that. And the way I understand the process, what was approved was a certificate of appropriateness that they would have to come back and, I don't know if it has to go back before planning commission for approval, or if they could just pull a permit right off the bat. But I think if we're going to have a moratorium And since that building is a linchpin, I want to say a linchpin of our downtown historic overlay district, that I think that moratorium should apply to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gregor. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R53, 2021?
Resolution number R53, 2021. Resolution establishing municipal services for certain territory containing 2.0 acres, more or less, in Concord Township, proposed to be annexed to the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is the Camfarelli annexation on Washington Road, first reading.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R54, 2021?
Resolution number R54, 2021. Resolution establishing buffer requirements for certain territory containing 2.0 acres, more or less, in Concord Township, proposed to be annexed to the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is also for the Camfarelli annexation. This is the second of three pieces of legislation required, first reading.
Second?
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Terwilliger. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
The three reading rule has been suspended.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Whidden. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R55, 2021?
Resolution number R55, 2021. Resolution consenting to the annexation of certain territory containing 2.0 acres, more or less, in Concord Township, to the city of Troy, Ohio, and declaring an emergency. This is the third item of legislation for the Camfarelli annexation located on Washington Road. First reading.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three-reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read Resolution R56, 2021?
Resolution number R56, 2021. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with the Miami County General Health District for health services. This is a 2022 agreement. City will pay $365,873.84, and as was noted, this is a decrease from the current year, and this is first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second?
It's been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Terwilliger. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The three-reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Twist and seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last resolution of the evening, Resolution R57, 2021?
Resolution number R57, 2021, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the West Main Street Duct Bank Improvements Project, cost not to exceed $700,000, first reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Whidden, seconded by Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move on to ordinances, and Mrs. Knight, will you please read Ordinance 062, 2021?
Ordinance number 062, 2021. Ordinance repealing ordinance number 053, 2020, and ordinance number 017, 2021, and enacting new hourly rates for various employees of the city of Troy, Ohio. This is the ordinance that covers temporary and part-time seasonal employees, reflects the minimum wage increase for the coming year. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Sievert. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Three-reading rule has been suspended and moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Schweizer, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 063, 2021?
Ordinance number 063, 2021. Ordinance imposing moratorium for a period of 180 days on the granting of certificates of appropriateness for the demolition or removal of a building, structure, or architectural feature within the City of Troy Historic Preservation Overlay District and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Thank you. Does council wish to add?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three-reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Twist. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes. Second.
Three-reading rule's been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the last ordinance of the evening? Ordinance 064, 2021.
Ordinance number 064, 2021. Ordinance imposing a moratorium for a period of 90 days on the granting of applications for new surface parking lots where said parking lot would be considered the principal use on that property and not accessory to a different principal use, and declaring an emergency. First reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. House Councilor Staff?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mrs. Snead. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Rozell and seconded by Mr. Schilling. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Whidden,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move on to communications and announcements. Mrs. Knight, do we have any this evening?
No, sir.
Thank you very much. Moving on to comments and officials, Mayor Odom.
Just to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. We won't have any public meetings before that, so we'll see you all after Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. First of all, you did pass legislation at the last meeting regarding the appropriations, meaning the easement appropriations. Happy to report that we have settled all of those, so you will not see any more legislation pursuing that. We will be, even though we won't have another council meeting beforehand, next Monday night, 6 o'clock, is the Finance Committee. May have a couple of miscellaneous other items, unless you really want to meet the following Monday, the 5th Monday. No? Okay. We don't need to take a vote
We'll
on
all
that.
be there.
And so we will be talking through the 2022 budget recommendations. So we will have that. On the 25th and the 26th, Thanksgiving and the day after, the City Hall will be closed, but we will continue to have recycling and refuse pickup on their normal days. There will not be any delays. I guess finally, on Friday night, we do have the annual tree lighting that will be at 7 o'clock or after. Unfortunately, in past years, a couple of times, the lighting has gone off just a little bit before 5 o'clock, and some families for 7 o'clock. Please don't quote me on that. So we, Troy Main Street will make sure that it is 7 o'clock or later.
Okay.
That's all I have. Thank you.
I did have one question. We will be having the Finance Committee meeting in the conference room downstairs.
The basement is normal.
Okay. And that will be videotaped for folks to see it?
We
We
do
do
not
all of our
typically
committee meetings.
videotape those because it's in the basement, but it is open to the public.
I have a question about grand illumination. Is that when door is going to commence? Have we made that determination yet?
No, we don't know that. They have the certification, or the Board of Elections meets on Wednesday night. To certify that, they will need signatures from all of the board members. Once that happens, then it can start the following week, which would be the week of the 22nd, which would be Thursday, which technically is Thanksgiving, but it would start that week.
Okay. So if everything goes smooth, that would be the first, grand illumination would be the first night that it would be in place? But Thanksgiving would be the first night?
It would be, actually, that is true. It would be open noon on Thanksgiving, but also noon on Friday. And Friday is a big shopping day downtown. It is Black Friday. So it could be open then as well.
But that, if the time frame all falls in place?
That's correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted to let people know. Thanks.
Moving on to Director of Law, Mr. Kerber.
I have no comments this evening. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Kerber. City Auditor, Mr. Friggy.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you, sir. Any comments from council members this evening? Mr. Rozell?
Just want to thank the Troy Newton Optimists for another great year of putting out flags and taking them down for over the years. It takes a lot of work for them. So anybody wants to join and help, they'll entertain those thoughts.
Any other questions or comments from council members this evening?
My wife got a car started. So for all those people that were wondering, that's all good. So she's back home and safe. And
I had the under, so I won.
you won.
She is the same.
Any comments from staff members in the audience this evening? Moving on to audience comments, if you wish to address council on any item, you're free to approach the lectern, give your name and address, take as much time as you wish to consume on any topic that you wish to address council on this evening. Seeing no public comments, we will entertain a motion to recess into executive session.
So move.
Second.
Do we need to read
For the purpose.
the purpose statement?
Yes.
Mr. Rozell, who made the motion, could you read the purpose statement?
Purpose statement is to recess into the executive session for discussion of preparing for, conducting, or reviewing negotiations of bargaining sessions with public employees concerning their compensation or other terms and conditions of their employment.
Thank you, Mr. Rozell, and does Mr. Schweizer continue to want to second that motion?
Yes.
Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Sneed.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Siebert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Motion is adopted.
We are in executive session. We thank you all for attending tonight.
We will not take action.
We will not take any action after the executive session, so thank you for attending. We'll entertain a motion to recess from executive session.
Motion to recess from executive session.
Second.
Do we have to read the whole thing again?
Moved by Mr. Rozell, seconded by Mr. Schilling to recess from executive session. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Whidden.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Siebert.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed.
Yes.
Motion is adopted.